thank you very much, all of you, for your patience. So as Professor Sani Umar has introduced himself, it's a great pleasure to have him here with us. He is presently in the Department of History of Ahmadu Bello University. There's a number of publications to his credit. In fact, a major book that was published on entitled Islamic Colonialism, the Intellectual Responses of Muslims in Northern Nigeria, published by Brill in 2005. And since then, there have been a number of continuing studies on the intellectual discourse, if I may call it like that, of Nigerians on the questions of by ulama and on the question of jihad and violence and things like that. So we're really privileged to have him here to share his thoughts with us. This is not the first time that you have, that you have shared some of your ideas. Unfortunately, I think it's been a long time. Yes. But you've been a busy person, and more importantly, the last time you were actually here in person. So we hope to see you in Cape Town, and soon, as soon as we can travel again. But for now, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and also willing to share, not only, particularly that you're not sharing a complete paper. And in fact, that's a privilege for us, that we see what you're thinking about and how you are thinking about this topic, and maybe to get into conversation. So we are going to record this conversation for everybody, and Professor Sani has agreed for us to upload it on YouTube. Our YouTube channel will make it available to you later as well. So Falyatafaddal, please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much for that generous invitation. In the interest of time, I'll just go ahead, present the ideas. Maybe I'll take 20 minutes or less, and then I devote more time to Q&A, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that's fine.
So the title begs for a definition, right? The terms I'm using, jihadism, is a neologism that has really gained currency maybe within the last 10 years or so. And it, of course, means different things to different people. And so also the word jihad itself. So I start with definitions, right? The sense in which I'm using it. Jihad, I would take to be the traditional concept from Islamic literature, from ancient classical Islam. And it is usually discussed in so many different ways that they usually do the traditional definition, which is they would take the root of the word in the Quran, which is JHD, Jahada, or Juhud, and they will then begin to build a interpretive discourse about what it means and what it entails. And the important point to note about the traditional conception of jihad is the several meanings of the term. Even in the Quranic usage, there are several meaning usage of the word or its derivatives that have nothing to do with either war or violence or even struggle in that sense. So, for example, in the word jihad in this context is more like disputation, verbal disputation, rather than anything to do with war. And of course, in the Quranic discourse, jihad is related to qital, which is more unambiguously to do with warfare. And in fact, there are many more Quranic verses on qital than you have on jihad. Similarly, in the prophetic tradition, jihad is said to be there's a small one and there's a big one of it. So what do you get in the traditional Islamic understanding? When I say traditional, I mean pre-modern, or the classical heritage of Islamic scholarship. What you get there is extensive debates and discussions about what the word jihad means and what it entails, different forms of it. There's no rush to say it means war right away. And even when it is discussed as a war, it is discussed subject to constraints. There are rules and regulations. There are legitimate and illegitimate targets, and it requires formal declaration by the political leadership and so on and so forth. That's my conception of jihad, a rich discourse about a Quranic concept that has multiple significations including, of course, warfare, but not only that. The counter to that, slide 3 now, the next slide. Are you there? Hello? Am I just talking to myself?
We hear you, Prof. And I think Prof.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes, we hear you. And Prof. Tayyub just moved the slides now. It's jihadism.
Okay, so that's the other term, which is more recent, more problematic to define. But my definition of the word, the sense in which I was using it, outlined here, the key elements of jihadism is the notion that the Quran is a text to be performed, not a text to be understood and interpreted. There's no time for discourse. It says, go ahead and do it. Whereas in the traditional jihad, scripture is a communication that requires understanding and interpretation before you can meaningfully do what it says. In jihadism, verses are regarded as a script to be performed. Do it right now. And jihadism also entails the notion that Muslims are obligated to wage perpetual war against non-Muslims, wherever they are. And there's also the notion of global conspiracy against Islam and Muslims. And part of the discourses of jihadism also is the proclamation of Muslim victimhood, as well as glorifying martyrdom, and so on and so forth. Whereas the traditional jihad is a just war. A just war means a war waged according to a criteria and governed by rules and regulations. But jihadism is not governed by rules and regulations. It's a conflict that goes on globally, and some of them even think of it in cosmic terms. And in a cosmic conflict is pervasive, it's everywhere. And sometimes even the combatants may not know that they are party to a warfare, so to say. So jihadism is much more expansive in its embrace of violence, and much more narrow in its discursive possibilities within jihadism are very narrow. There's not much room to discuss. Next slide, counter-jihadism. Are you with me?
Yes, bro.
Hello? Counter-jihadism, that's the third discourse. Counter-jihadism, obviously, from the time you can see, it is a rejection of jihadism. And it is attempt to reaffirm the traditional classical understanding of jihad as a just war, as a war waged according to a criteria, which is different from a holy war. Some people translate jihad as holy war, which is not accurate. A holy war is a war waged on behalf of a deity, and it is not subject to human constraints. God said, do it, you just go ahead and do it. Jihad is more like a holy war. It's waged on behalf of human beings for specific human objectives that are subject to regulations and so on and so forth. Similarly, cosmic conflict is like holy war. It's not subject to human control. It's not a war humans initiate or can control. It rages on its own. So counter-jihadism rejects the expansion of jihadism into either cosmic war or even holy war, properly understood. So it calls for consideration of social and political realities confronting Muslim communities before they start embarking on warfare. There's also an element of apologia, in the sense that there's hesitancy to say that the jihad also involves warfare. The emphasis is that jihad is moral struggle, is spiritual struggle, is a jihad of the mouth and jihad of the heart and so on. The jihad of the sword is only defensive. This is the apology I'm talking about. It's not correct to say the jihad of the sword, even in classical Islam, is purely defensive. I think it is better understood as the military institution of Islam understood as a political system. As a political system, it has to have its own capabilities, its own military capability. And in that case, the jihad is that military capability. Whether it goes on the offensive or it goes on the defensive will be dictated by the political realities that are pertinent And sometimes in the counter-jihadism discourse, because it is a contemporary discourse, it has additions that are not noticeable in the classical formulations. So I hope I'm doing good in time. This is just the definition of the key terms I'm working with. I hope we are good on time. Are we? Hello?
Yes, we are good on time. I just switched off I muted myself so that other sounds do not interfere. Okay.
Oh, very good. So
Yeah,
these are the key terms that we are working with: jihad, jihadism, and counter-jihadism. And my struggle to understand this is within the broader context of contemporary debates raging among Muslims globally, especially in the last 50 years or so. In the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 19th century, there are so many debates raging globally among Muslims. Sample of these debates include what Amina Wadud calls the gender jihad, which is concerned with struggle for equality among men and women, but it is also a debate that touches question of religious authority. Who can will religious authority? Only men, or can women will spiritual authority? This, as you can tell, is a very touchy debate across Muslim communities everywhere. Questions of gender equality, question of Muslim women's right to will authority, will religious authority, which is severely in contestation. And that leads, what's her name, Amina Wadud, to title one of our collection of essays, The Gender Jihad. Another huge issue in the debate is about Islamic law. Whether Islamic law should be codified and enacted by legislative authority of the modern state, or it should remain what it has been in the classical tradition, namely a juristic discourse. Islamic law is articulated by the jurists in their discourses and doctrines and traditions of interpretation. Which way to go forward with Islamic law is another big issue. Islam in public or in private life. This, of course, raises the question of the big issue of secularity and secularism, whether Islamic societies have experience of separating religion from politics or not. As I pointed out, religious authority is also in dispute, including prophetic authority, the authority of the prophet. What is the extent of it? What are the limits of it? The authority of scripture, the authority of the past, that is the Muslim past. How much are Muslims bound to what happened in the classical heritage? And the authority of the modern, to what extent are Muslims to obey authority of modern developments? The nature of Islamic religious virtue, the debate about gulu and wastia, whether excessive religiosity is Islamic virtue or not. This is one major debate. And then, of course, Muslims and democracy, Islam and democracy versus Islam and theocracy, question of religion, state, and society. Islam in the traditional homeland of Muslims and Islam in the diaspora, especially in Western Europe. And the question of what kind of public infrastructure is necessary for the practice of Islam. Must you have majority context, or you can practice correctly all the traditions of Islam in a minority context? And then, of course, the big debates, what make all of these other debates salient and resonant across the globe is the question of media. Islam in print, on TV, and on the internet. And then also this raises the question of authenticity. Where do you find authentic Islamic teaching? So it is part of this diverse debates raging within the Muslim community in the last 50 years or so, that the debate about jihad should be understood. It is part of that broader trends. And within that broader trends, jihadism is constructed and deconstructed. And I want to now take focus study of this broader debate, but would focus on jihad. And I choose the Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun, the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, and its branches in the other Muslim countries to examine how this debate has unfolded. Using the concept of discourse means that you look at the debates as intellectual articulations, but you also look at praxis. You look at how those ideas come into play in tangible social context by particular people enacting or disputing the ideas that are formed in the debate. That's the meaning of discourse that I'm working with. So we look at the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, both the intellectual articulations and the practices that are tied to that articulation. And it may not perhaps be necessary to take a long history of Al-Ikhwan right from its founding by Al-Banna, but nevertheless, it's important to recall that even in its origins, it has these strong components, one of which is strong anti-Western stand. It has the burden of debating the Western influence of Muslims. It could not just ignore that. And I call that the burden of the West and the burden of the history. Muslim discourse cannot proceed without contending with the Western hegemony. And we see that amply reflected in the origins of the Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun. And an interesting point is that that burden of the West imposes a constraint on Muslim discourse, and so many modern Western ideas have been domesticated and made to look like they are authentically original Islamic ideas. One of these is the concept of al-Nizam al-Islami, the concept of Islam as a system, as a comprehensive system covering everything, as the Ikhwan theoreticians made it. This conception of the comprehensive nature of Islam is influenced by modern systems theory. You will be hard-pressed if you look in classical traditional Islamic thought to find the expression al-Nizam al-Islami or al-Nizam al-Shamil al-Islami. Of course, Islam is pervasive in the social order, but there was an understanding that certain aspects of Islam are not as important as certain aspects. And clearly, historically, political power has somehow separated itself from religious obligations in the classical tradition of Islamic tradition. It doesn't, political power is not deemed to be like thorough Islamic kind of thing. There are debates about it, but the poverty of Islamic classical discourse on political power is very clear when you compare it to the richness of Islamic discourse, say, on marriage or on contracts, commercial law. If you look for the fiqh of power, the fiqh sulta, in classical Islamic tradition, is very impoverished debates among few literati people like Mawardi, who are not great Islamic scholars or great scholars of Islamic law, but more like realist thinkers and so on and so forth. But this notion of al-Nizam al-Islami, that Islam is a total way of life that is so popular now, is one of the modern constraints of the burden of Western hegemony on Islamic traditions. And of course, this idea of the Nizam al-Islami and the privileging of power and politics in it led the Al-Ikhwan to a tragic alliance with the military revolutionaries that brought the Nasrite regime into power, with the support of Al-Ikhwan and with what turned out to be terrible miscalculation on their part, that once they support the regime, they will be able to control its ideological agenda. So before too long, the fallout was brutal. Sayyid Qutb was one of the victims of that, but all the other leaders were arrested and detained. And in the case of Sayyid Qutb, he was detained for so long before he was eventually executed. And there are reports that he was badly abused in prison, and his bitter experiences in prison led him to develop a very, very negative view of the modern state, which he articulates in the famous short book he wrote, Ma'alim fi Tariq, where we see a Manichaean view of politics and the idea of the modern state as unredeemable evil, and the necessity to overthrow it and restore the power of God in the concept that he called the Hakimiyya. So they have some quotations there on the screen. I hope you can see them. One of the characteristic marks of this faith is the fact that it is essentially a unity. So this is the Islamic system, the totalitarian impulse. It is at once worship and work, religion and law, theory of society. Is obviously reflected in the beliefs and custom of this religion, and that this represents the basic, powerful, universal theory of all social life. This kind of comprehensive totalitarian conception of Islam is problematic, but it is part of the legacy of the thinking of Al-Ikhwan that led them to catastrophic political consequences. And Sayyid Qutb also not only not only borrow Western ideas and imposed them on Islamic thought, he also took traditional ideas and transformed them completely. The concept of Jahiliyyah in traditional Islamic discourse is a period of history before the advent of Islam, and it is usually used discursively to define Islam as a religion of monotheism and law and order, whereas before Islam was a moment of ignorance and lack of order and civility and so on and so forth. So he could have transformed a historical concept into an ontological one. He made Jahiliyyah to be a mode of existence that is the antithesis of Islam. And then the concept of Hakimiyya, sovereignty or power or rule, he also sacralized that idea that only God deserves power. No power is legitimate unless it is the power of God. So these kind of ideas led to the crisis within the Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun. Many of the leadership were incarcerated, and the Nasrid regime, of course, discarded any pretension to being an Islamicist regime. And some of the leaders in prison had change of heart. Sayyid Qutb did not, but other leaders of Ikhwan that were detained began the debate to revise the traditional, to revise the key doctrines of Al-Ikhwan. And among them was the Murshid Hassan al-Hudaybi, one of the leaders of the Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun after the debacle with the Nasrid regime. And during his leadership, an intellectual transformation began to occur within Al-Ikhwan. And this is captured in his book, Du'at la Qudat, that Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun should not be judgmental, judging everybody as unbeliever, only they possess the correct, pure, authentic Islam. Instead, they should work like du'at, people who will preach and invite people to Islam instead of judging them. This transformation continues under the next murshid. Next slide. Umar al-Tilmisani. Are you there?
Yes, yes.
Further revision of the intellectual ideas of Al-Ikhwan, especially departure from Qutb's view. And during the time of Umar al-Tilmisani in the 1980s, there was a formal and official rejection of the ideas of Sayyid Qutb. And this paved the way for members of Al-Ikhwan to participate in electoral politics, which would have been completely haram within the doctrine of Sayyid Qutb, because it is a Jahiliyyah system which denies the Hakimiyya of God. So participation in that kind of politics is not going to be Islamic according to Sayyid Qutb. But by the time that Sayyid Qutb ideas were rejected officially by the Ikhwan al-Muslimun mainline, it became possible for members of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun to begin participating in parliamentary elections. So we see this kind of connection between intellectual articulations and practical consequences of those debates. In the early phase, the argument led Al-Ikhwan to join the military coup. It turned out very negatively. Now they revised their ideas and they are now willing to participate in politics. And this change is not only within the Egyptian main body of the Al-Ikhwan. Other branches also accepted the idea that, contrary to Sayyid Qutb, participation in electoral politics is valid Islamic practice, In fact, someone like Rashid Ghanouchi goes further to argue that it is not only Islamically valid. Rashid Ghanouchi, are you there? The slide number 16, Rashid Ghanouchi.
Yes.
Here we see the argument that participation in electoral politics, what Sayyid Qutb will have called Jahiliya politics, is necessary, is dictated by the concept of darura. This is the argument Rashid Ghanouchi is making, that necessity dictates that Muslims should participate in the political process, even if the political process is not Islamic. And this can also be supported by by the doctrine of Amr bil Ma'ruf and by a principle in Islamic law. Whatever is necessity, the means to it also become necessity. So we have very forceful argument in Islam, traditional Islamic thought, to argue that contrary to Sayyid Qutb, the doctrine of Jahiliyyah, it is permissible to participate in electoral politics. Next slide, I have an extended quotation from Ghanouchi. He said, power sharing, are you there? Power sharing in a Muslim or non-Muslim environment becomes a necessity in order to lay the foundations for the social order. This power sharing may not necessarily be based on Islamic Sharia law, which in Sayyid Qutb Jahiliyyah system, that's not allowed, or Islamic government. However, it must be based on an important foundation of Islamic government, namely Shura, the authority of the Ummah, which is a very interesting interpretation of the Ummah, so as to prevent evils of dictatorship, foreign domination, or local anarchy. I underline this part of the quotation. Such process of power sharing may also aim to achieve non-religious goals like national or humanistic interests such as independence, development, social solidarity, civil liberties, human rights, political pluralism, independence of judiciary, freedom of the press, or liberty for mosques and Islamic activities. That is very pure secular liberal disposition. Nusina posed the question, can any Muslim community afford to hesitate, should we participate? Can any Muslim community afford to hesitate in participating in the establishment of a secular democratic system if it is unable to establish an Islamic democratic one? The answer, he said, is no. They cannot hesitate to participate. They must participate. And now here comes the impulse from the classical Ikhwan way of thinking. Instead of leaving the argument like that, he now sacralized the argument. He said it is a religious duty of the Muslims as individuals and as communities to contribute to the efforts to establish a system. If you take Islamic legal thinking, so Rashid Ghanouchi cannot establish a new religious duty. And the way he stated it there without any warrant, without any argument, cannot stand. It shows the impact of Qutb's way of thinking. The argument he made is good and solid enough as he made it, on the basis of the darura, or on the basis of Amr bil Ma'ruf, or even on the basis of maslaha. But to now say it is a religious obligation to participate in politics seems to me to push the point too further. So within this context that the likes of Ghanouchi are making democracy to become a religious obligation, there was a resurgence of Qutb's ideas that come back with a vengeance and led to the assassination of Anwar as-Sadat. But that was preceded by a debate, like the one in the book of Faraj Auda, Al-Farid al-Ghaiba, that the Muslims have neglected jihad. Jihad has become the obligation that nobody wants to do. And there was also another debate within the ranks of Al-Ikhwan, especially people who are not very happy with the compromises with the regime. And this includes the likes of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and his mentor, Dr. Fadl, otherwise known as Sayyid Abdul Qadir Abdul Aziz, who wrote a very massive volume called Al-Umda fi Idad al-Udda, which has been translated by German scholars, proper signposts in preparation for the jihad, that is, preparing for the full jihad to be unleashed now. So we are now going back into, or we will see the eruption of jihadism now. Apart from the debates, we now see this intellectual debates. This is the English translation of the major work. The Farid al-Ghaiba, the neglected, which is a minor tract. This book is a more massive, more systematic argument for the jihad. And it will lead to the Al-Qaeda waging the global jihad. We see some of those ideas are echoed in, next slide. Are you there? Next slide. Okay, so we see these ideas that were articulated in the writings of Farag and Abdulaziz and Ahmad Zawahiri. They begin to be implemented by by Osama bin Laden and company, who issued a fatwa. Next slide. So this is the newspaper. Can you enlarge this one on your screen? This is a photocopy of the page in which Osama bin Laden made the global call for jihad. Can you enlarge this text for people to see the text? The text is somewhere there. No, the news. This one. Can you enlarge it on your screen?
Unfortunately, not. No,
it's not possible.
Not. No.
Okay.
I try to make it as big as possible,
but it can't get bigger.
How does that look like?
But can you read on the left column? On the left column below, Bayan Jabhat something. Let me see.
نص بيان الجبهة الإسلامية العالمية
لجهاد
اليهود والصليبيين.
That is Osama bin Laden's formal declaration of the global jihad, following the transformation of ideas about jihad and jihadism within the ranks of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun. So if you go back to the previous slide, I have some excerpts from that declaration that was published in that newspaper. Are you back on the previous slide? The rise and decline of global jihadism.
Yes, I'm there.
So we begin to see the implementation now. Typical, we see the quotation from the Quran: when the holy month, when the forbidden months are passed, then fight and slay the pagans everywhere you find them, seize them, beleaguer them, and lay in wait for them in every stratagem of war. And also a quotation from the Hadith: I've been sent with the sword between two hands to ensure that no one but God is worshipped. God who put my livelihood under the shadow of my spear, and so on and so forth. These are scriptural authorities that are being quoted for implementing the jihad. So from this quotation, here are the conclusions that next slide, after the one with the newspaper. Next slide. Next, here are the conclusions that Osama bin Laden drew. For over 7 years, the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest places, the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is not a holy place. Mecca and Medina is, but the Arabian Peninsula is not, plundering its riches, dictating it to its rulers. So these are the victimhood, the element of victimhood in the discourse of jihadism. Next slide. Said Qutb and Osama bin Laden appeals to the classical heritage, quoted Ibn Qudama and Al-Kisai and Al-Qurtubi. And then he said, as for the militant struggle, it is aimed in defending sanctity and religion, and it is a duty as agreed. Nothing is more sacred than belief except repulsing an enemy who is, and on this basis, on the classical heritage and on the quotation that he made. Next slide. So Osama bin Laden's call for the global jihad, the ruling to kill the Americans, and their allies, civilians and military. It's an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Mosque from their grip, and in order for their armies to move out of all the lands of Muslims, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. So here you see the global reach of the jihad. It no rules, no bounds, no limits. Civilians and military, they are all legitimate target. In jihad discourse, that is not correct. Civilians who are not in arms are not legitimate targets. Here, there's no notion of legitimate and illegitimate target. No space is safe. Everywhere is a global jihad. So this is jihadism. This is one element of jihadism. We see the construction of victimhood. We now see this global reach of the jihad, and we see the quotation of the scripture to say, fight the pagans all together as the fight would. So just go ahead and do it. Don't start asking questions about what is the meaning of pagans, and how do you fight them, and so on and so forth. So with this now, the ground was prepared for the next slide. Okay, so from that discourse now, the road was often led to the attack on the World Trade Center and the terrible consequences that followed that. That is the kind of the consequences of jihadism: a war without rules, a war without limits, an indiscriminate attack on the enemy and the non-enemy. Everybody is a legitimate target in that kind of war. That, of course, brought the reaction of the Americans' invasion of Iraq, of Afghanistan and Iraq eventually, and then the indiscriminate violence that engulfed many Muslim countries, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Algeria, Turkey, Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. These are the consequences of jihadism. This is the praxis of that debate. Continue. Now, next slide. So following the implementation of the Al-Qaeda script for the jihad, the attack on the World Trade Center and the consequences, which were very catastrophic for Muslim societies, any right-thinking person will start to ask questions. And then within the jihadists, debates begin to erupt again. Dr. Fadl, who has been called the mufti of the jihadists and the master theoretician of jihadism, published a book called Wasiqat Tarshid Al-Amal Al-Jihadi, in which he begins the deconstruction of jihadism. And if you look at the next slide, you see some newspaper coverage of his ideas. The book was serialized in an Iraqi, in a Kuwaiti newspaper initially. This is a blank slide, you can delete it. Then the next slide, can you see a Tabri'a?
Yes.
Okay, so Dr. Fadl, who wrote the authoritative guidebook for the jihad, Al-Umda fi Al-Udda, in the Wasiqat Tarshid Amal, he rejected the views he had advocated before. He recognized the errors that have crept into that system of thinking, and it has led to catastrophic consequences. And he's calling on the jihadists to have a rethink. Well, immediate reaction to that was from Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who published a Tabri'a, sort of the disowning of the Wasiqat Jihad. And in response to that, the two previous slides, debate within the ranks of the jihadists. Not that one, the previous one. Yes, so we see Dr. Fadl published Wasiqat Tarshid Amal al-Jihad, which begins the revisionism of the construction of jihadism. Al-Zawahiri responded with Tabri'a, which is the Tabri'a to Ummat al-Kalam, Ummat al-Nabis, I can't remember the full rest of the title, like, God forbid, we will never stop jihad. Absolutely not. So Dr. Fadl replied with another book Ta'riyat Akazib al-Zawahiri, scandalizing the lies that al-Zawahiri published in his Kitab al-Tabri'ah. Then, while this debate was going on, the other factions within the Al-Ikhwan that also embraced jihadism, including Al-Gama'a al-Islamiyah and Gama'at al-Jihad, also were having a debate within themselves about the validity of jihadism. So now the next slide, this one, Nahar al-Zikriyat, no, next one, Nahar al-Zikriyat, Al-Muraja'at al-Fiqhiyya lil-Jama'at al-Islamiyya. This is the first of series of books in which Jama'at al-Islamiyya renounced jihadism, unilaterally declared ceasefire, and prepared the way for subsequent pardon by the Egyptian state. This is the first book that detailed the soul searching that began with the leaders who had been released from prison, and they visited the various prisons to persuade their comrades that they were sorry they misled them into the terrible mistake of jihadism, which claimed the life of Anwar Sadat and numerous other innocent people. So a subsequent book in that debate include Mubadarat Waqaful Unf, the unilateral ceasefire that the Al-Jamal Islamiyah announced, is discussed in this small pamphlet. They also come clean in another book called Taslid al-Adwa, ala ma waqa fil jihad min al-akhta', shedding light on the terrible mistakes made in the course of doing the jihad. And there you go. Then Hurmatul Gulu fi din, excessive religiosity, wa takfir al-Muslimin, the kafir, declaring other Muslims kafir so you can do jihad on them. All of these ideas were rejected and renounced in this series of publications. Briefly, the debates in these publications give the reasons for stopping the jihadism against the Egyptian state and society, because the threats to Islamic identity and civilization from the imposition of Western civilization in the name of globalization, clash of civilization, end of history. So echoing the triumphalist discourse in the West that all systems have become invalid and history has come to an end except for liberal Western liberalism. And the war on terror, which led to catastrophic consequences in Muslim societies, while Israel continued to deny Palestinian rights. All of these factors were considered. And then the next slide. So the ceasefire was necessary in light of those catastrophic consequences of the jihadism. Does this mean jihad is no longer valid? They say no. No Muslim can deny the obligation of jihad because of Quranic quotations, but jihad is not a comprehensive conflict, no rules, no regulation. Jihad is what? Subject to conditions, causes, barriers, intents of the Sharia. So this speaking with language, I hope you can hear it, is shurut, asbab, ma'ani, and maqasid Sharia. This is speaking with discourse, that jihad is to be understood within fiqh, not as a unilateral warfare against civilians and military and everywhere you can find them. And jihad should be purely for the sake of God, so that, quotation from the Quran, there will be no fitna and the whole of religion will be for God. And that jihad is not a goal in itself. Next slide. Jihad is subordinated to a higher goal. What is the higher goal? There's Maqasid Sharia, protection of life and so on and so forth. On Sayyid Qutb, they come clean. Sayyid Qutb was a great thinker of our time, but his experiences in prison, many people thought were formative in his ideas. This Al-Ikhwan said, no, it is not important. But that his writings were more of a literary figure, that he was trained. He was never trained as an Islamic scholar. He was never a jurist or never a theologian. He was a literary critic, and that influenced his way of writing. And that it is a great mistake that to receive Sayyid Qutb's ideas as if they were Islamic law that is ready for application. So clear renunciation of kutub. And then this idea you get in the debate is this juxtaposition between the sacred text, the divine intent, that's maqasid sharia, and human interest, that's maslaha. So now we are back to classical discourse, that scripture is a communication. It's not a performative text. It's a communication that requires understanding. And first, you understand, what does God want? What is the intent of God in sending the message he sent? Try to ascertain that. And that the consensus, one view was that the intent of God is to protect maslaha. And the important maslaha are religion, life, wealth, family, and so on and so forth. And therefore, every text, whether it's kutub or not kutub, should be read in light of the divine intent to protect human interests. And the readings of the text of jihad as declaration of immediate war were in error. And then on takfir, which is the part of the discourse of jihadism, jihadism repels ordinary Muslims from the jihadis. They thought they would be celebrated as heroes. They were not. They caused a lot of trouble for many people. Instead of being honored, they were not. And jihadism also was contrary to the divine intent of promoting human interests. And to the extent that jihadism involves some suicidal strategy of using suicide bombing, it is contrary to Quranic discourse about tahluka, self-destruction. I think I should stop at this level now. I have a historical background, but I think to allow time for Q&A, I may summarize them. So what I have been looking at are what? My training in classical Islamic tradition, and I'm always struck by how different it is from modernist Islamic discourse. Traditional Islamic discourse is pluralistic, is tentative, and is really aggressive. I mean, you see the plurality of it, like for example, 4 different understandings of Islamic law are all accepted within the Sunni community. There were more than 4, but 4 have survived to the present. Within the Shia, there are 4 different interpretations, all of which are deemed to be valid. This is the inherent pluralism of that discourse. In modern discourse, you don't see this pluralism. And so all of my work has been to navigate between modern Islamic thoughts and its contrast with the traditional Islamic thought. And whenever I do this comparison, Islamic traditional thought emerges as richer, more uplifting, more inspiring, and modernist discourse, because of the burden of Western influence on it and the mimesis of the Western hegemony in its discourse, saturate the modernist Islamic discourse by and large, but not, of course, for every modern Muslim thinker. In a nutshell, these are the ideas I'm wrestling with. I don't know if they have come across with any coherence or not, but I will stop here and thank you, and then wait for Q&A. All right?
So thank you very much, Sani.
Yeah.
I have switched off the screen.
Very
so
good.
That basically
I can also do my own, so you can see my face, right?
I mean, you can keep it there just in case there are questions. I can immediately bring it up
Me too.
as well.
Okay, I just put it on the side.
Okay, so just so that we can try to navigate ourselves through this technology. But so first of all, thank you very much for sharing that very extensive, almost like a kind of a narrative of the historical trajectory of jihad or jihadism, as you call it, from Qutb or from Hassan al-Banna up to the present, at least late 1990s, at least in Egypt.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And you've also, I think, raised some critical questions about how you call it, jihad versus jihadism. And I invite people to just to raise their hands, and I will recognize them, and each one will get a chance to have a short comment or a short question. I'm emphasizing short because we have to keep in mind that there's quite a few people, and everybody to give everybody a chance to speak. Okay, so I'll try to manage it just to see. I'll see your hands as soon as they come up. So while we await, okay, there's already somebody from Rivka. Sorry. Okay, Rivka, please go ahead. If you, when you are speaking, you can just open your video as well if you can, so that Professor Sani can see you. After that, immediately just switch it off, just so that, yeah. Okay.
Salam, good evening, everybody. Shukran, Prof, for that that wonderful sort of literature review, I suppose. I just have one question. Maybe it's a silly question. I don't know. Does jihad necessarily have to be physical warfare? Because surely I take the saying, there's more than one way to kill a man, very seriously. So surely there's more than one way to gain justice in the form of jihad. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, it does make sense. I mean, the thrust of my understanding of jihad is that it is multidimensional concept. That even, it's not just about war. Many usage of it has nothing to do with war. But even when jihad is used in the sense of warfare, and there's no running away from that part of the understanding, part of the traditional understanding of jihad is that it means warfare. But even when it is so understood, it is constrained by rules and regulations that many people have said are among the most civilized in the human history of thinking about warfare. But that may take you to the realm of apologia. So the short answer to your question, yes, jihad is not the only means to do conflict resolution, and it doesn't only mean war. It means many, many things. But among the many, many things it meant also is warfare. You can't take that away from it. I hope that responds to your question.
Okay, so Leo Igwe is one of our postdoc researchers here. Well, he's in Nigeria, but he is part of our group. Leo, please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Sani, for the lecture. My question is, you talked about the war with rules and regulations and war without rules and regulations. Who makes these rules? And if there aren't a particular authority that makes the rules, then don't you think that all these groups can make the rules on their own? You know, the different groups, whether they're in Egypt or Nigeria or Nigeria, can make the rules. So the question is this: these rules we are talking about, regulations, who makes them? What's the name of the authority that makes the rules? And if there isn't a specific authority that makes the rules, then don't you think that every other group in other countries can be authority on its own and make their rules? So you are jihad, it becomes jihadism, and jihadism becomes jihad. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, if you take any manual of Islamic law, you find a chapter on jihad. Like all the other rules of Islamic law, they are formed juristically. They derive authority from the scripture and from the prophet himself. But every rule of Islamic law, whether it's about food or about dressing or about war or about politics, follows a juristic tradition of how you formulate a rules and the way in which that rule may be deemed to be valid or invalid. Is not as arbitrary as it may sound. It is bound by first authorities of scripture and the authority of the prophet, and then by the convention of the scholarly elite. Islamic law is what has been called juristic law, the jurist law. You need to understand that structure. So the short answer to your question, who formed the rule? The rule is formed in Islamic law by the traditional method of formulating Islamic rules, rules of Islamic law on any subject. As such, it is not as arbitrary as it may appear. Not everybody can wake up and say, okay, I make my own rule today. If you make your own rule today, it will be invalid. Islamic law it has validity, it has authority. It is not arbitrary. If you are familiar, it is similar to rabbinic law in the Jewish tradition. The ultimate authority is scripture, God. But human enterprise is prominent part of it. as such, you can't just wake up tomorrow and say, my new rule of Islamic law is this. It will not have the validity. So that is I hope the answer is clear to you. Who makes the rules? The rules are made by the competent authorities who make all of Islamic rules, all of the rules of Islamic law. And it is not everybody who can make that law. Okay?
Okay, so we have a question from Mohsin Ibrahim. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. Prof, that was a wonderful presentation. You mentioned that traditional Islam has been rather plural, given the fact that there are 4 schools of thought in the Sunni tradition. Can we generally say today Islam is plural, looking at how, for example, some people believe in this jihad and others don't, and how, for example, fighting has been raging in some Muslim countries, and those parties, are calling themselves Muslim. And well, we can't say, for example, who is more Muslim and who is not. Can we say that therefore there are Islams, not just Islam as a single entity? Thank you.
Well, yeah, the pluralism that I'm talking about and the example of the 4 schools of law is just a mere surface of the issue. The traditional Muslim way of thinking, that's what I'm interested in, and the way it manifests itself. If you look at any learned Islamic text, you will not see the insistence of that my view is the only correct view. Every other view is invalid. There is a popular saying in among the juristic scholars of Islam, which says our school of law, our understanding of Islam is correct, but could be wrong. The other people's understanding of Islam is wrong, but could be right. So this tentativeness is so deeply ingrained in the traditional Muslim way of thinking. Nobody can be sure about what God wanted. Nobody will claim to speak the mind of God authoritatively and confidently. They make the best shot at the human beings, make the best attempt to understand what God wants human beings to do in his holy book. And but they don't have any guarantee that they got it right always. So therefore, whenever they give any understanding of their understanding of Islam, they will sometimes preface it by expression like Wallahu alam. Only God knows best. My own attempt has no guarantee for validity. Or they will say Allahul Muwaffaq li-sawab, may God help what I said to be correct. But what? No guarantee that what you say is authentic, valid mind of God. And that opens the room for tolerance, for accepting alternative views, even if you disagree with them, because your own view is no longer, it has no any validity on its own. This creates what I call the tentativeness, not only the pluralism, but the tentativeness, the unwillingness to absolutize any position. And as such, yeah, you find, if you like to use the word Islams in pluralizing in English, it is not much different from the understanding that there are Sunni Muslims, there are Sunni Islam, there's Shia Islam, there's Kharijat Islam. There is so many different types of understandings and discourses and articulations of what Islam is. Nobody has monopoly of that. There is no authority on earth which can make the authoritative definition that this is the only correct Islamic position on any issue. There's no such authority. Therefore, people do the best they can. And those who understand Islam well, they say that's the best we can do. We can't invalidate anybody's understanding.
Okay, thank you so much. I've got a question from the chat. I will read it. This is Salam. Can Prof shed some light on why things have turned the way they are now vis-a-vis the classical jihad discourse and contemporary jihadism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the political situation of Muslims and the too much global attention on acts of political resistance in some Muslim countries.
That's a tall order. Yes, the debate is going on. It's not over yet, especially in the age of internet and rapid self-population. Books are being released almost by the day. And that's the richness of Islamic intellectual heritage. Never-ending debates about important questions. There's no end to the debate. And in that kind of deliberation and ongoing debate is enriching. But there comes a time also when the debate now comes into the practice. And this is where now political dynamics may abbreviate the debate or suspend them in the face of grave political problems to be solved. The luxury of the debate may be suspended and until the atmosphere gets more conducive for more scholarly contemplation of big issues that have no easy solution. So yes, in the different contexts, in different parts of the world, political and social reality of Muslims are quite different, and they may be entangled in all kinds of conflicts, which might not be necessarily religious, but it may acquire religious coloration. If you take the biggest conflict is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Many people fail to understand that the issue in contention in that conflict is not religion, it's a piece of land. That's what they're fighting about. They're not fighting to convert each other to their own version of the religion. And many of the conflicts that may have religious component, when you analyze it carefully, you discover that at best, religion is a complicating factor, but not a motivating or the triggering, the driving factor in the conflict. So conflicts are facts of life, facts of human life. They're happening everywhere. They get bad, they get good, they get intense, they get resolved, they get resurfacing. You live with conflict. That's the way the world works. And Muslims are no exception from that basic reality. But the debate, the scholarly debate is ongoing. If only you care to look for it, where it is happening. It's happening, of course, these days online, but in the academies, it's happening in the academies, in the mosques, in the sermons, many places you look, you will find the debate going on. And I think there is great tide now against jihadist ideas, because even the jihadists themselves have come clean to acknowledge how erroneous they were in their understanding. I hope this answers the question. It was a tough one to try.
Okay.
Next.
So there's a question from Faisal Karba.
The genealogy of jihadism?
No, that's another question, okay. But we'll first listen to Faisal Karba. Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof, for a really interesting talk. So I have one question and a small comment. And my question is rather provincial, really. So when you were speaking about, this injunction that, people must take part in building, an Islamic polity. So my question really is, if one thinks of the notion of al-Islam din wa dawla, and one takes that to particular moments in Nigeria, I would say, right? And I will say it in Hausa and then translate in English. That, at some point I was just saying that siyasa tafi sallah, so politics is far more important, is more important than prayers in certain contexts. So I'm wondering what that does for a particular push towards a very narrow interpretation of a political community, but also a very narrow interpretation of the possibility of interpretations in terms of this pluralism that you are speaking about. And my comment relates to the point you made about, how jihadism has led to what you call the consequence of the attacks on Iraq.
Catastrophic consequences.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if one could also think of it as a cycle and sort of a consequence, given how jihadism has been co-opted for purposes of political economic hegemony, you know, in particular moments, right? And so this catastrophic consequences that we see, it's not just like a consequence, but it's also part of a larger power struggle where it is discarded at times and co-opted in other moments by dominant powers. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. The Islam Din wa Dawla. Yeah, this is part of the modernist thinking. There is no privileging of power and politics in traditional Islamic thought. In fact, if you look at the jurisprudence of power, the Muslim traditional discourse on politics is like nothing to write home about. They don't think it is important. And a popular aphorism says, "Law ansafa nas, lastaraha al-qadi." If people were to be just among themselves, there would be no need for a judge. That's abbreviation for saying politics is secondary. It's not. It doesn't elevate to the level of religion. That is a modernist heresy, if I may say so, that religion and politics are on equal pedestal. No, in traditional Islamic thought, not at all. Politics, maybe you may think of it as necessary evil, perhaps also, but not the privilege pursuit that stand on the same pedestal with religion. If you look at the fundamental intent, the concept of the Maqasid Sharia, there's no politics there. Religion is number one. Politics is not among the fundamental intents of. So Din wa Dawla is like an Nizam al-Islami. It's a modernist train of thought. And many, Gumi, when he made that statement about voting being more important than religion, he invited so much criticism against him. If you look at it, I mean, you look at it very carefully in traditional Islamic learning. Politics is not a privilege. It's not a privilege pursuit. Religion is paramount. Family is paramount. Society is paramount. Even wealth, private property are all protected, but politics ranks very below in the hierarchy of Muslim priority. And your question about the cycle or the consequence, I will tie it to the other one that I saw on the screen about the genealogy of jihadism. The neologism, the coinage, is probably not more than maybe 20 years since the rise of the Al-Qaeda fighting. One Western author that has written more extensively about it and with great understanding, I'm trying to remember his name. He used the expression, it's not Robin Wright. Robin Wright is a woman. If the name comes to mind, I will mention him.
Yeah. Are you thinking about the French?
No, Kippen doesn't use I don't think he used jihad, not jihadism. He's an American writer, actually a journalist who also writes books. He has a very good essay on Sayyid Qutb as the master theoretician of jihadism. But another genealogy for the concept of jihadism is what I omitted from the presentation. That would be the historical background, the use of jihad in modern times. It can be traced to colonial resistance. Western conquest or Muslim societies provoke resistance, and that resistance was understood as jihad across vast expanses of land. My work was on the Muslim intellectual responses to colonialism, and that response includes the view that it is obligatory to resist militarily, and that will be jihad. And as far as India and Indonesia, you find similar debates among Muslims that colonial conquest must be resisted militarily, and that military resistance is jihad. So that's another genealogy of the term. Now, this would take it further to at least 200 years into the modern era, from perhaps the Napoleon invasion of Egypt at the end of the 1700s, going forward to the middle of the 20th century. And the jihadism also continues that tradition, because the colonial conquest now implicates the Muslims in the technology, in the modern technology of power, especially the modern state system, and it is apparatus of power and control. Most of what the jihadis want, most of this discourse about Diwa Dawla, all they want is to capture the modern state and use its formidable powers for control and domination to implement their agendas, religious or ethnic or political. And that's the work of General Kipel, who argued that the political project of jihad has failed spectacularly. If that's jihadism, if the goal is to capture the modern state power and use it to transform society according to the religious views of the jihadis, there is no viable jihadist state in power anywhere in the world. And it can be, because it will provoke formidable resistance from the international system of state. It can't be tolerated. It will be ousted out of power. In addition, Muslim populations have shown time and again, they're not interested in Islamicist state. Every time the jihadists conquer a territory, Muslims flee because they're not interested in the draconian understanding of politics that these people want to impose on them. So in Mali and in Nigeria and in other parts of the world, when jihadists conquer territory, they want to do Islamic State, Muslims population flee, they run away. And they welcome the French colonialists in Mali for liberating them from the Islamicists. So the political project of the Islamicists is not viable. Yes?
There's one more question here from Aslam.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, Professor, whether you think, the tradition, the Islamic intellectual tradition has really decisively answered the question as to whether, jihad is declared for the defense of a political authority or a polity, or for a doctrine. There doesn't seem to be much clarity on this. If you go back to the pre-modern context, the modern context, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of colonial struggle, the defense seems in this case to have been for the polity. If you go back to the formative periods, it seems to have been a defense of a doctrine. These lines seem to be somewhat blurred. I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, the pre-modern debate doesn't have the clarity that you wish for, partly because it is tentative, partly because it is always an ongoing. Even when a book is written authoritatively, somebody will write a commentary on it, and somebody will write another commentary on that, and the debate goes on and on and on. So yes, in the classical debate, the legitimate goals for waging jihad will include protection of religion on the top, because it's the number one in the Maqasid Sharia, life, property, human dignity, and things like that. Defense of territory is territoriality, especially its connection to the modern state. It's not clearly understood category in traditional Islamic way of thinking. It is a modern state that has this notion of absolute clarity. Ambiguity is problematic. It has to be resolved, and it has to be resolved authoritatively, that this is the clear position. In the Islamic traditional thought, clarity is not necessary. Approximation is enough. People can live with the ambiguity of whether it is the defense of doctrine or defense of territory. I think you will even find more jurists in the classical tradition saying you can vacate the land and move to wherever you can practice religion freely. You don't have to defend a land if it is under attack. You can leave it and go to where, that's hijrah. And you see that, for example, in the conquest of Spain, and in the Maliki tradition, raised several debates about defending the territory versus defending other important considerations. And it's reverberated throughout the West African region until the modern times when colonial resistance contemplated that issue. Many people were willing to immigrate. They would vacate the land and leave it for the conqueror instead of defending it, which in the thinking of the modern state, that is unthinkable. You have to defend the fatherland to the last soldier. You can't abandon it. I see a comment on a question again on, from Mr. Igwe on whether Danfodio is a modernist or a traditionalist. I think he's a traditionalist, thorough and thorough traditionalist. Yes, another question?
Yeah. So I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know if there are others, but maybe I'll pose one or two questions. Yeah. You basically did, you opened the question with an argument that, in jihadism is basically of a performance in the way you called it and not necessarily a discourse. But in the course of your lecture, you presented quite a lot of debate and discussion going on. And the jihadists, well, we call them jihadists. I don't necessarily like the term, but let's call them, the activists or the mujahideen. They basically, that's the one thing that they, we disagree with them, but the one thing is that they never lacked enough literature. They're always writing books. And we might say that, they have raised the question of irja, they've raised the question of lots of different debates as such. I mean, so in a way, I'm just wondering whether, I'm just questioning whether you see them as not, why are they not part of the discourse? As a continuing discourse of jihad in the modern world, which is dominated by, capitalism and the modern state formation. And this is their response. As you said, basically, they were responding to American invasion of the Arabian Peninsula, the Western cultural invasion. I mean, these are all obviously there's a lot of debate about it as such, but this is a very clear argument that they make that that there's no more place for Muslims to actually live the Islam as before.
Yeah, they have debates and they do participate in debate, but the privileging of performance is striking in some of their writings. Like all these nuanced debates about the rules and regulations, you can leave those aside and do what you need to do. That is the emphasis I'm laying upon, that the privileging of practice over the traditional, seemingly never-ending debates and deliberations and commentary and super commentary and so on and so forth. But as soon as they start the debating, as soon as they get into the discourse, sooner or later now they begin to doubt the jihadism. They begin to doubt the components of the jihadism one by one. They start to fall. And what you ended up with is the Mubarak of, they go back to the classics, and now you get into the richer discourse that is interminable, as I'm saying, that doesn't have decisive clarion calls. You live and do this right now. But otherwise, if you look at the call to the jihad, it's a clarion call that privilege the practice. They said so in many of their writings. You can see that all this long debate should be left aside, and the practice, the emergency of the urgency of the moment calls for immediate action rather than debate. And when they start to do the debate, then that's when their jihadism begin to crumble. It can't withstand intellectual scrutiny. Certainly not the type that the traditional scholarship brings to bear on any issue. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But let me follow up with a question. I'm looking. I don't want to dominate the discussion, but if there's no hand up, I will ask another question.
Yes.
Certainly, I mean, in the way that you presented the discussion and debate, it is true. It's in Islamic scholarship, including people like Al-Mawardi, who were then opposed by others, in Islamic politics. But these are all, ulama that are basically no longer in control of the state, or no longer in control, or no longer at the head of power. So, I mean, isn't this particular group of people actually, trying to go to a situation before? That means before the emergence of the Sharia scholars. We know that before the emergence of Shafi'i, for example, or before, I mean, Shafi'i himself was actually joining a Shiite rebellion, Hassanid rebellion, until he basically changed his position. So in a way, you can say the jurists were the juridical discussion was actually produced, in a period of in a context where they didn't have power anymore. I mean, that is why you can actually have these debates and discussions. But isn't the justification that now that Muslim societies are completely taken over by a different ideology, civilization, culture, whatever you might call it, a justification to go back to the to the jihad that is being called across in the Quran, that these are critical times that require critical opportunities. I know I'm summarizing it, but I'm just saying that this is why we might say that it's not as if they ignore what the scholars are saying, but they also are arguing for a very different kind of a basis on which to argue. They're going back directly to the verses of the Quran, the verses of the Hadith, in critical times, like Muslims are surrounded, like the Prophet was surrounded by the Meccans.
Well, even if they are going back, they are not taking comprehensive look at all the relevant sections of the Quran and then trying to see if there is a categorical, clear position to follow. The kind of cherry pick, the basis that would justify the politics. The politics is the predominant preoccupation. The religious validation of it is secondary. That's the argument I'm making, that this privileging of politics is kind of new. In the traditional system, politics doesn't have this privilege. They never had power, and the ulama never had power. They never probably aspired for it. They yielded to power, basically. I mean, if you look at the discourse, the great Islamic scholars, the greatest minds, don't address questions of politics as such. The Islamic political thought, traditional Islamic political thought, compared to traditional Islamic legal thought, you can see where the energies of the brightest and the most gifted scholars were devoted to. You search in vain for that kind of nuance and rich discourse about power, about politics, about political institutions. You don't find it. And in previous times, there were, of course, Muslims encounter with other systems, with the Greek system, for example, which was very formidable and left its impact on Islamic tradition in so many ways. It didn't provoke the political alienation that the modern confrontation with non-Islamic system has provoked. Perhaps because of the clear, decisive difference in power. Yes, modern Western powers are vastly superior to those of the Muslims. So if your priority is politics, yeah, you will be frustrated how you confront this challenge. But if your priority is not politics, you find a way to live with this, and you find a way to circumvent it and pursue your important goals without bothering about this. That's what the famous saying, the institutions of the state as represented in judgeship were not that necessary if only people will behave right, but they won't. So you need that to the extent you can control the aggression of the powerful against the weak. But the bigger pursuit in life are elsewhere. This is the way I look at it. I'm not sure if I understand the import of your question, but this is my response.
No, I think it's very clear. Yeah. Okay, so I don't see it. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I think you raised some interesting question, and also at least thinking about the politics as such. But I'm wondering if I could just leave one small point again about the jihadism. I mean, I think that's something that I need to think about, because I think it's as you said, it's a word that is used by journalists to speak about a phenomenon.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think that my sense of it is that discussions on jihadism or the jihadis as such say too little about the interference of Western powers in Muslim countries. I mean, I think that if you look at the record over the last couple of decades, for example, including, I mean, the case that you looked at in Egypt, for example. You know, the fact that Anwar Sadat was wooed, you know, out of from the Soviets to the Americans, then went into, you know, alliance with the Israelis, for example, basically selling off the country. So I'm just wondering to what extent one can leave out the political context which gives rise to these kind of movements, you know, and then maybe also, you know, in a way they are also reflecting these developments as well. Whether you want to actually talk about jihad without talking about modern political systems, and also particularly, you know, I mean, obviously different countries are different, but certainly the Middle East has been a terrain, you know, as soon as from the time that, you know, Iran emerged as such, like you said in one of your comments, you're not, there's no toleration for alternative political systems.
Yes, I talk about the burden of the West on the modern Muslim thinking. I didn't go into great detail to elaborate along the lines you are thinking about. You're absolutely right. The power imbalance is extreme, and it warrants more detailed attention. But I think of it as imposing a burden, not only a political constraint on the choice that Muslims can make, but also a burden on the way Muslims think. It is such a heavy baggage to carry. Virtually every discourse is the subtext, always. There's a response to the Western hegemony in one way or another. Western hegemony in the political and military sense, in the economic sense of it, but equally importantly, the intellectual sense of it. There's no way to ignore that. And like I said, the portion of the presentation I terminated, I didn't go into, will have pick up the colonial origins of the trend that became jihadism. I mentioned it briefly that it started as colonial resistance. And in a significant sense, the post-colonial state, to the extent that it is what African nationalists used to call neo-colonial, to the extent that the post-colonial state, even after independence, continues to carry the agendas of the West in one form or another, the genealogy of the anti-colonial resistance continues. And in a significant sense, it is the internal dynamics for the different jihadist movement were internal political repression. Egypt, in particular, which I mean, like the mother incubator for jihadist thought and jihadist practice, it's the what do you call it? It's an authoritarian, brutal regime. Incarceration of the activists, Muslim activists, and their executions and all kinds of brutal practices by the state itself on behalf of its allies in the international system, mostly United States, is part of that burden that overshadows the modernist Islamic thinking. It can't afford to ignore the Western challenge. Even when it is not engaging it explicitly, it is still a subtext. I think we're in agreement. It's just a matter of where you place the emphasis on it. We don't want to over-privilege the Western challenge. It can be resisted, it can be neutralized, it can be bypassed. But to continue obsessing about it is the burden that limits the possibility of what people can do.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to stop it there because we've taken quite a lot of time. But thank you. There's one more person, but since he has asked already, I'm going to close the meeting because I see some people are busy leaving because they've been here for about an hour and a half now. But Sani, Professor Sani, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Your preliminary thoughts as such, sharing this kind of genealogy of jihadist literature. You can see we're already accepting the term that you're using. But it's also the term that is the dominant term.
Yeah, help me come with a new term so that
I somehow don't like it, but I think it unfortunately, whenever we speak about this, we speak about it. And I somehow think, they might be able to, but I don't agree with them, but I think that it is very much part of the discourse, what Islamic discourse is. It's this variety. Sometimes it goes off in a different direction.
Yes.
So I think that, but first of all, thank you very much. And we will, we appreciate the time that you've taken and also sharing this with us. We hope that maybe, I'm not so sure, maybe if I could leave you with perhaps a suggestion, if you could maybe do something similar on the Nigerian discussion on jihad, perhaps from Usman bin Fodio until the Boko Haram. Maybe something similar would be quite interesting.
Yeah, that would be a long time down the road, right? Not immediately.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I thought of adding a section. I thought of adding a Nigeria section into this presentation, but I saw it is getting out of control, so I stopped it.
Yeah. No, I think that's perfectly understandable. But thank you very much. I think that the questions that you've raised can be asked, of different contexts. I think you've also shown a kind of a trajectory, that shows you this the discussion that goes on, or at least the debate that goes on, and also the practices associated with it. And I think you've left some interesting questions about discourse and performance as such that maybe we might want to test, in different kind of contexts as such. So thank you very much. I also want to thank everybody else who have joined us here. We've had quite a few number of people, and I'm just sorry that I have to close it, but at some point we have to, all good things do have to come.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Assalamu.
Okay, bye. Assalamu.